Okay, Jai Hind, everyone. I'm sure some of you would have seen the latest CIPRI report. While it gives number of issues, it also talks of the increased arsenal of nuclear weapons. And surprising component in that is what has been updated even after the initial release of the report, that China has put its nuclear arsenal, some bit of it, on the high alert. This practice was actually very common only in United States of America and Russia. However, China is the new entrant in that particular field. In fact, if you see the activities of China, any country or any organization whom it sees as a hindrance to its aspiration to become the only superpower of the world, it is trying to initiate multiple measures to reduce that kind of opposition. More so, it is highly active in South China Sea. And in South China Sea, besides troubling multiple nations like Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, which is bordering it in East China Sea, it is mainly focused on Taiwan and its integration. While majority of the countries in the world are not opposed to peaceful integration of Taiwan with China, but most of them are against the forceful integration of Taiwan in the Chinese mainland, and that thought is being propagated by United States of America in a big way. Number of activities which are happening in Taiwan, I think they need to be looked at more seriously, because the way multiple conflicts are emerging and have the possibility of them getting enlarged in the regional conflicts, the day is not far when something may happen between China and Taiwan also. And if it happens between China and Taiwan, not only USA, its close allies and number of other countries are also going to get involved. We are very fortunate today that we have an excellent professional, Arzan Tarapore, who shall be speaking to us on this important subject and also indicating what are the policy options for India. More about him, I will request our senior fellow, Group Captain Amitav Mathur, to speak about him before we invite him to take the talk.
Good morning. A word about the speaker. Mr. Arzan Tarapore is a research scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. His research focuses on military strategy, Indian defense policy, and Indo-Pacific security issues. He was previously has held research positions at RAND Corporation, the East-West Center in Washington, and in the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. He was also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where he taught MA core class on grand strategy and military operations. His work has been published in International Affairs, Journal of Strategic Studies, Foreign Affairs, the Western Quarterly, Asia Policy, and many other newspapers, as well as by Carnegie India, CNS, and Lowy Institute, amongst others. Prior to his scholarly career, he served for 13 years in the Australian Defence Department in a variety of analytics, management, and liaison positions, which included a diplomatic posting to the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC. He holds a PhD in War Studies from King's College London, an MSc from London School of Economics, and a BA Honours from the University of New South Wales. Over to you, sir.
Okay, Arzan, thank you very much. And now the stage is all open to you. All the best.
Excellent. Thank you very much, General, and thank you everyone assembled today. I want to talk to you about what I think is one of, if not the biggest geopolitical issues in the Indo-Pacific, one of the biggest security points of friction between the United States and China. And it's an issue that, if anything, is the most likely to result, the issue that is most likely to trigger a conflict between the United States and China, which would be, previous slide, please, which would be which could be a cataclysmic world war, right? I know also this is top of mind for the government of India because it is astute and it is a keen observer of the region, and it knows what stakes are involved. And my intent with this piece of research that I would like to brief you on today is to feed into that discussion, to feed into that process of deliberation in India about what options India might have to help deter Chinese aggression against Taiwan. Those two locales, right, Taiwan and India, seem on the face of it to be distant. They seem to have not a lot in common. But I hope to persuade you today that not only is it in India's interests, but also that India has useful tools available to it to help contribute to deterrence so that China does not launch aggression against Taiwan. Next slide, please. This research is mostly covered in a publication that came out a few months ago from ASPI, from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It's available online, as you can see on the at those websites. And this piece of research is not very long, but it took a long time to compile because of the gravity of the issue. We thought it was important to consult widely. So I spoke to not only researchers, but importantly also to government officials in the United States, in Australia, in Taiwan itself, and also in New Delhi on an informal basis when I was recently there. So this is the product of extensive consultations, and I think what we have come up with as the end product is a piece of research that is primarily focused on India, but in fact it's also applicable to other countries that I'm calling non-belligerent states, right? So these are states that we presume probably will not fight, will not be engaged in direct combat in the defense of Taiwan against China. But nevertheless, these are states that have an abiding interest in maintaining security and stability in the region. Next slide, please. I don't plan to talk for very long. I'd be very keen to have some discussion with people assembled, but this is the outline of what I want to convey to you today. Firstly, just to lay out the premise of the talk, to establish what the problem actually is, that there is in fact a problem when it comes to Taiwan, and then to move on to this issue of what I'm calling non-belligerent deterrence, right? So this is the deterrent actions that states who will probably be non-belligerent, who will probably not take part in combat, but the policy options that they can nevertheless enact to help contribute to deterrence, to make sure that such a conflict never occurs. To then go into some detail about how India could act, right? Not being prescriptive, but just laying out 6 broad types of policy options that India and other states would have available to them. And then I want to conclude with a short piece that's actually outside the scope of that prior published paper that I pointed to, on why India should act to help build deterrence. The paper is concerned only with what India could do if it chose to take the political decision to act. But I actually think it's in India's interest, in India's own self-interests, to actually enact some measures in peacetime. Next slide, please. So the problem, as I see it, is that, and I'm not alone. I hasten to add, I am not a China specialist. So the situation across the Taiwan Strait, the situation with China's foreign and defense policy is something that I must keep an eye on, as anyone who works on the Indo-Pacific must. But it's not something that I am deeply expert in. But nevertheless, the premise of this research, my research, is the received wisdom among most China watchers, which is that the military balance across the Taiwan Strait is shifting in China's favor, right? For decades, indeed, ever since the Civil War, China, Beijing, the Communist Party of China, has harbored an intent to reclaim Taiwan. But until very, very recently, that was a completely ambit claim. There was no real military capability. Only very recently has the CCP and its People's Liberation Army begun to actually build real capabilities that could pose a real threat to Taiwan and and create a real chance of success for the PLA. Those capabilities, I won't go into any detail, but they essentially are heavily reliant on standoff weapons. They're heavily reliant on C4ISR, on what the Chinese call informatized warfare, and they're heavily reliant on the Chinese doctrinal precepts of A2AD, right? Anti-access and area denial, basically to keep the Americans out, to stop an American intervention from thwarting China's goals. And the capabilities are being explosively developed over the past decade or two, and we are now on the cusp. My China expert friends say not quite yet, but we are on the cusp of China achieving the capabilities required to launch an attack on Taiwan. And it's not just the development and production of tangible military equipment. It's also the very important, the critical intangible elements of military capability that go into its ability to conduct such an operation. So everything from training to exercising and to creating the operational environment through a constant series of probing incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone, for example, that serve the purpose of training and practicing for such a contingency for the PLA, but also desensitizing Taiwan and the United States to a gradually elevated level of PLA activity, right? So they're changing the normalcy patterns so that when they choose to launch an attack, it becomes less noticeable. The preparations for that become less noticeable. We've all heard of what we now call the Davidson window, named after the former commander of Indo-PACOM, Admiral Davidson, who articulated the opening of a window of opportunity for the PLA that would begin around 2027. And that's based on a directive that Xi Jinping gave to the PLA to reach certain capability milestones by that time, by 2027, to essentially give the CCP military options, viable military options to take action if the CCP so chose, right? So 2027 does not say that anything will necessarily, the Davidson window does not say that anything will necessarily happen in 2027. It just is to suggest that that is the opening of the window of possibility where China becomes more emboldened to think that it has genuine military options, right? So we enter an increased period of risk from that period. The flip side of that is that not many other countries will fight in the defense of Taiwan. Taiwan obviously itself will. There are big question marks over the resolve and capability of the Taiwanese military and people to resist, right? So one of the key surprising facts of the Ukraine invasion was just how surprisingly stalwart Zelensky and the Ukrainian military and national security apparatus was when faced with a Russian invasion. There are question marks over how Taiwan would react given a similar situation. The United States, we think, I think, is quite likely to come to the defense of Taiwan. It is not American declared policy to do that. American declared policy is strategic ambiguity. That is very deliberately the policy of the United States. Excuse me. But if it did choose to take action to defend Taiwan, if the president did choose to do that, The US faces real insurmountable problems of time and space, right? Of physical problems of geography. It would not be able to adequately reinforce its positions in the first island chain for a couple of weeks at a minimum. To the time that it would take to mobilize, deploy, and then move from, for example, San Diego or even Honolulu to the first island chain or to the weapons engagement zone in the first island chain would be measured at a minimum in several days, if not several weeks. So it faces that problem of geography. Japan is absolutely critical to such a fight, precisely for that reason of geography. So the US forces deployed in Japan would not only have to be involved, but also the Japanese self-defense force becoming involved would add a step change addition in military capability on the side of the defenders. And then it's very likely that another regional country, Philippines, would probably wind up being dragged in. Australia would very likely join the United States if the United States chose to act. But its contribution would, frankly, and I say this as someone who worked in the Australian Defence Department, its contribution would be relatively minor, and again, mostly a function of geography as a sanctuary for US forces. So so the problem is that China's capacity to attack Taiwan is rapidly increasing, and on the other hand, there are few countries that would come to Taiwan's aid in such a contingency. Taiwan itself, the United States, maybe Japan, maybe the Philippines and Australia, right? And so the argument that I'm mounting is that despite only so few countries likely becoming belligerents in such a conflict, the problem of deterrence is actually much wider than that. Or to frame it positively, the potential for deterrence is much wider than that. Many other countries in the region have an interest in avoiding such a conflict, and many other countries, therefore, also have some potential to act to enact policies that might contribute to deterrence. So let's take a look at what that might look like. Next slide, please. Here, I want to discuss what I'm calling in my paper the idea of non-belligerent deterrence, and I think this is an important distinction to make, because traditionally, when we talk about deterrence, we argue, the canon argues, that you can only deter an adversary if you can show credibly your capacity to either deny the adversary its goals, that is deterrence by denial, or to impose prohibitive costs on the adversary, that is deterrence by punishment, right? So only if you have the military means to either thwart or make the enemy reconsider its goals, only if you have those military means would you deter it. My argument is that, in fact, that's not necessary. That, in fact, even without becoming a belligerent, even without helping to build the defenses of Taiwan, for example, or without committing to act as a combatant in such a campaign, countries around the region can still play a useful role in deterrence. So that's my sort of core argument. To make that argument, I think we first have to understand the red side, right? The adversary side, and my, again, received wisdom is that Beijing has a comprehensive plan for Taiwan. This is not, I underscore, not purely a military issue for China, right? The military line of effort, if it becomes invoked, if the CCP uses it, is only one among many other tools at the CCP's disposal. Unification is a core interest, a core interest of the CCP, a core element of Xi Jinping's personal legacy, of his China dream, of the CCP's overall grand strategy of national rejuvenation, right? So unifying with Taiwan is a goal that China holds without compromise. But while that is an uncompromising goal, it is still open to multiple ways and means of achieving that goal, right? It's a very comprehensive campaign utilizing all instruments of national policy. I would argue, moreover, that the CCP would prefer, if it was confident of it, non-military unification to military unification, simply because the costs of a military unification would be much greater, and in fact the uncertainty of a military unification would be quite high as well from the CCP's point of view. So if you think of Taiwan as a no-fail scenario for the CCP, right, again, a core element of its national rejuvenation that it cannot fail on, then it is going to deploy all elements of national policy, and it does. Beyond just the military means, we see China deploying what they call three warfares, right? Legal arguments, narrative building, information operations. We see China deploying an economic strategy. We see China deploying an information strategy, all designed to isolate Taiwan and to get a non-militarized capitulation from Taipei so that it unifies without having to fight. The critical implication of that is that China can be deterred from a military attack. Now, this may seem sort of logically obvious, but in fact, the discussion in some quarters in Washington, for example, has gotten so heated that it's lost sight, I think, of this very important fact that China can, in fact, be deterred. Right? The discussion has become so self-referential and so panicky that there is a sense that war is inevitable. My argument is that, in fact, war is not inevitable, that China can be deterred, but it would only logically be deterred if it believed that non-military options remained viable. If we shut off the non-military options for Taiwan, for China, then it will be undeterrable from taking military action. But as long as it believes that there are non-military options available, then I believe it remains deterrable. Next slide. And so this gets to what General Kumar was saying at the beginning, that there is a distinction between goals that often get conflated, but there is actually a distinction between the goal of deterring conflict and the goal of deterring or opposing unification. They're two different things, right? Often, especially in some quarters in Washington, we see those two things conflated because there is a sense that any unification of Taiwan would be so catastrophic for US interests. But in fact, that sort of rhetoric, that sort of heated rhetoric that we cannot let the Chinese reclaim Taiwan is actually undermining the deterrent message because it leaves China no option but to use military force. If instead we focus on the goal of deterring conflict, then we leave open, we suggest implicitly that other goals are not off the table and that they are still worth pursuing as far as Beijing is concerned. Now, India and others, I would surmise, will not fight in the defense of Taiwan. And so there is no question that India will be able to change the military balance across the Taiwan Strait, either by aiding Taiwan or by becoming directly involved itself. But my argument, as I was saying before, is that India, as well as other states, can help to convince Beijing that Beijing, has not set the conditions for a military attack. Again, if we accept that the campaign, that China's campaign for Taiwan is a comprehensive campaign using multiple means of national policy, multiple instruments of national policy, and if we accept that Xi Jinping is fundamentally a conservative leader who has set for himself the goal of unification with Taiwan and does not want to mess this up, does not want to take risks with this, then I think any prudent planner in the CCP and the PLA will want to ensure that they adequately set the conditions before launching the decisive phase of operations, whatever that decisive phase of operations looks like, whether it's an amphibious assault or a blockade or a missile assault, whatever form the contingency takes. Before they launch on D-Day, they will be adamant that they must set the conditions for that military assault before they undertake it. And so my argument, next slide please, is that this is where countries like India can have the greatest impact, right? Convince China that it cannot succeed in attacking Taiwan because it has not set the conditions. So this is not, again, a matter of physically impeding the CCP from overtaking Taiwan. That's the job of the Taiwanese and the Americans. But to deter China by suggesting that now is not the time to launch a military operation. That in fact, to convince Beijing that in fact, it needs to do more to set the conditions, to prepare the ground, to shape the battle space, whatever phraseology you want to use, the prudent measures of phase 0 and phase 1 operations before you launch your decisive phase of operations, that to convince Beijing that that work has not been adequately done. And that if China does launch military operations without setting those conditions, then it would introduce more risk to its strategic goal of unification, that it would in fact, that in fact it does not have the confidence of succeeding, and that it needs to push out the timelines, right? That the Davidson window may open at 2027, but it may not close for decades. And so the ultimate goal of deterrence is to convince Beijing that today is not the day. We are not ready to go yet because we still have work to do to set the conditions. So that, to my mind, is where countries like India can play. Next slide, please. Turning to India, I focus on India because, of course, I study India, but I think even objectively, when you look at non-belligerent states who would be interested in avoiding such a conflict, India stands head and shoulders above the rest because it has a wide range of policy tools available to it. My argument is that there are a range of options that India has, and each of these options, and I'll highlight 6 of them in a minute, but I would argue that along each of these 6 lines of effort, policy action can be calibrated up or down, can be done in a more modest way or in a more ambitious way. And that calibration can occur as political circumstances merit. So when, for example, tensions increase, the policy actions can be calibrated to become more ambitious. And it doesn't have to be a one-way calibration. They can also be ratcheted down as the political conditions dictate. So I would suggest that there are multiple lines of effort, and each of those lines of effort can be calibrated up and down. India is also important because of its position in the international community. We hear nowadays a lot about India's role leading the global south, which I think is absolutely true. It contests for influence in the global south against China, but India has diplomatic influence in corners of the globe that the United States does not. And so India's role in contributing to deterrence would help to mobilize parts of the international community that would otherwise be very happy to sit this one out. And when people say this is not India's fight, well, I would agree that it's not directly India's territory, but I would argue that India has shown a political will to act, to take bolder action that would previously have been thought of as unthinkable, especially since 2020. And you only have to look at, for example, India's approach to the Quad, which until 2020 was very cautious. And after 2020, I think after the Ladakh crisis began, India was much more enthusiastic in engaging in a much more meaningful way with its Quad partners. And the Quad suddenly went from being an officials consultation mechanism that occasionally had foreign ministers talking, and it went suddenly to a regular summit level interaction with direct policy deliverables every 6 to 12 months. Right. So just if you look at the Quad, India has shown a political will to act that even months earlier would have seemed unthinkable. And you can say the same things with regard to military deployments and infrastructure development up near the LAC. And you can see the same thing, and possibly in historical terms, this will be the most important. You can see the same things in the US-India relationship just in the past 18 months with initiatives like ICET, right? The Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology, where India and the US have both committed, I think in a way that is surprising for both sides, have committed to integrate their technology innovation ecosystems and defense industrial bases in a way that would have been unthinkable until quite recently, right? And so when you look at examples like the GE F414 engine deal to actually transfer technology in a way that has not happened for decades and never happened with the Soviets, for example. When you look at the interactions and the integration on issues, everything from seabed mineral exploitation to space cooperation, the degree of cooperation and integration is frankly surprising. And if you had suggested to anyone 2 years or 3 years ago that India would embark on this level of integration with the United States, I think they would have been skeptical. And so my point is here that when I outline for you some of the policy options that I am about to, you may initially think, well, this seems like it's not really something that is characteristic for India to do. Well, India has shown a remarkable ability to be flexible and to adapt to changing circumstances. And so my argument here, the purpose of my work is not to say that India needs to do all of this all at once, but to think about the different options, the menu of options that are available, and to begin to consider what the political climate is like and what the political climate will accept and tolerate at this point, so that when the political climate changes, India is well postured to enact more ambitious policies. Okay, that's the logic, that's the theory of non-belligerent deterrence and how India could act. So let's speak about specifics. Next slide, please. As I foreshadowed in my research, I outlined 6 buckets of policy options, 6 lines of effort that India could usefully undertake. And again, not just India. India has the capacity to undertake all of these to varying degrees, and other countries may have the capacity to undertake some or a different combination of them. So let's go through them fairly briefly, but I'm happy to elaborate on them in the Q&A. The first is international law advocacy. Here, the argument that I make is that we, the like-minded states who care about the status quo and who oppose China's aggression, have ceded the ground on international legal arguments to China. We have let them set the terms of the debate to be a debate about Taiwan's status. And that, frankly, is a tough debate for defenders of Taiwan to win. Instead, what I would suggest is that there are other international legal arguments to be made, specifically about the inadmissibility of the use of force across the Taiwan Strait. Now, you might say, well, if Taiwan's status is in fact just as a renegade province, then any use of force would be a domestic use of force across the Taiwan Strait. The argument that I would make here is that there is a considerable body of conventional international law, of precedent in international law, that suggests that even domestic uses of force, internal uses of force, have negative repercussions for international peace and stability, and are therefore illegal or inadmissible, right? And so the idea that a domestic fight would have international repercussions is a matter of fairly settled international law. And not only that, but it's law that India has signed up to in the past. When India had a non-permanent rotating seat on the UNSC in 1991-92, India voted in favor of UNSC resolutions that were passed unanimously dealing with Somalia and Yugoslavia, which made these arguments that the conflicts within Somalia and within then Yugoslavia still posed a threat to international peace and stability and were therefore cause for UN action. Now, I'm not advocating that India or any other country take this matter to the UN Security Council. I'm merely suggesting that there are international legal arguments to be made that do not do not cede the ground to China's initiative by talking about Taiwan status, but that in fact change the terms of the debate to be about the inadmissibility of the use of force. We set aside the issue of Taiwan status. That is irrelevant. The only thing that we're concerned about is whether the use of force would be admissible or not. And frankly, for many of the countries in the region and around the world who wish to see continued stability and who don't wish to see aggression across the Taiwan Strait, they lack a neutral, non-controversial argument that they can rally around. But if there is an international legal argument that is advanced thoroughly and aggressively about the inadmissibility of the use of force, then that gives countries a flag to rally around. And one example of that is the Philippines arbitral ruling in 2016, where in 2016 the Court of Arbitration said that in fact China's claims against the Philippines EEZ were illegal in the eyes of international law. And at the time in 2016, not many countries, a handful of countries, came out in support of the Philippines and of that arbitral ruling, because most countries, frankly, were scared of Chinese repercussions if they did. But that 2016 arbitral ruling has since stood as a point around which others could subsequently make statements in support of. It's become a rallying point for other countries to say, well, in fact, we do support international law, and we do therefore reject China's claims on the Philippines EEZ. And more countries have come out in support of that Philippines arbitral ruling in the year 2023, that calendar year of 12 months, than they did in the previous 7 years put together, right? So the point is that you don't have to bring a resolution to the UN Security Council. You don't have to even bring anything before any international arbitral ruling. You just have to make an argument that can then stand as a neutral, apolitical point of unity for other countries. The second policy option is to put forward narratives, again, that are opposed to conflict. Again, I would argue that countries that are in favor of the status quo have ceded the field to China because we fall into the trap of debating the Taiwan issue around the notion of the one China principle, or the one China policy, or China's right to national unification. And someone recently, in fact, put together a data set about countries, other countries, mostly in the global south, that have signed onto this language, this Chinese narrative about the one China principle and China's right to national reunification, when in fact there are other narratives that we like-minded status quo countries could be advancing. Again, one of those narratives is that war is illegal, right? Whether or not you consider Taiwan to be part of China, any military action against it would be illegal. A second narrative could be that war would be catastrophically, cataclysmically costly for the whole world, especially for countries that are more intimately tied to this region economically, but also for the whole world. So framing the narrative around the costs of conflict would be much more productive in generating opposition to aggression than discussing the minutiae of whether Taiwan is a part of China or not. And there is a narrative that we can direct at China itself. Who would have thought that months or years after Russia invaded Ukraine, that NATO would in fact expand, and that Ukraine would be seriously considered, and that NATO would seriously consider offering Ukraine a path to membership. For Russia, these were unintended consequences, to put it mildly. And so the narrative that could be put to Beijing is, listen, no matter what happens on the island of Taiwan, there are second and third order effects. There are unpredictable consequences of a conflict that may wind up being even more damaging to your national interests. And so, for example, issues of the Japan's nuclear policy, whether Japan goes nuclear, issues of, again, deeper US-India industrial integration, are all strategic effects that are foreseeable. That would in Beijing's eyes be unpredictable and deeply negative consequences, no matter what happens on Taiwan itself. The third policy option is coordinated diplomatic action. Here, it's a matter of not only advancing narratives in public and in the information space, but also taking that message to Beijing's door when in bilateral or multilateral settings talking to China, or when China is not involved, in articulating these abiding principles of international law that aggression across the Taiwan Strait would be unacceptable. India, as I said, has tremendous diplomatic leverage, and not only leverage not only by dint of being a member of many different organizations and having many different relationships, but also it has shown diplomatic acumen, right? And so when you look at India's hosting of the G20, and before it was the host of the G20, when in Bali it managed to cobble together a consensus document using the phrase, this is not an era of war, right? That shows, I think, an ability for India to harness and marshal diplomatic tools to send messages that few other countries have. The fourth line of effort is to de-risk economically from China. Now, obviously, there are already pre-existing reasons to do this, but so far, that has been undertaken from a sort of strategic industries or sensitive technologies perspective, right? So impeding Chinese investment in Indian telecommunications, for example, or banning certain apps, etc. So there is already a pre-existing impulse to de-risk, but the Taiwan issue adds a different flavor to this. The rationale here, excuse me one sec. The rationale here is that China is very likely to use economic coercion against states that do any of the first three policy options, right? There is very likely to be some sort of economic lever that China seeks to pull to dissuade countries from acting in this way. And so the argument here is that to shield India from that economic coercion, that provides another rationale for economic de-risking, and it should provide a rationale for undertaking a thorough understanding of India's points of economic vulnerability when it comes to economic coercion from China, and focusing on those. So, for example, we all know that the precursor chemicals for India's pharmaceutical industry, for its automotive industry, the components for its electronic industry all come from China, and so there are specific sectors where China has particular leverage over India, and this is an analysis that could be repeated for any other country, where India has a new rationale for de-risking in these sectors. There's another economic rationale, which is that given a contingency, it is a certainty that the United States will impose sanctions upon China. And when it does that, there will be second and third order effects of that. There will be unintended consequences of that, again, as we saw with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And so there is that is an argument for countries like India to begin the conversation with the United States today to understand where the US sanctions will target China and to de-risk appropriately, to understand what the second and third order effects of US sanctions on China would be on India, and to de-risk from that. The fifth line of effort is information operations. The premise here is that China understands that the information domain is critical, if not possibly even the center of gravity for Taiwan, right? So the idea is that it seeks a rapid capitulation from Taipei, and in order to prepare the ground to shape the battle space, it has begun a pretty aggressive campaign of information operations against the Taiwanese people and political class. We see that time and time again with, for example, most recently with the Taiwanese elections in January. And so the argument here is that, I mean, there's not much that we can teach the Taiwanese about defending themselves from misinformation and disinformation. They're actually world leaders on that. But there are other more aggressive or offensive options available to any country with cyber capabilities, and that is to go on the offensive against the China-based, the mainland-based perpetrators or disseminators of this mis and disinformation. There are precedents for this when, for example, the US Cyber Command discovered particular nodes in Russia that were conducting election interference in the United States. US Cyber Command launched offensive cyber operations against those Russian networks, basically to take them offline, to impede their access to the internet. And so having a demonstrated capability for offensive information operations against the Chinese information operations actors would further insulate the Taiwanese people from the information operations designed to undermine their resolve. And the final policy option is the sole military one. You will notice that of the 6 policy options that I outlined, 5 out of the 6 are non-military. Only the last one is a military one. And here I'm talking not, again, clearly, as I've said many times, not about India participating in the central front in and around Taiwan. And I would argue not doing 2 things that we often hear India should do, right? In the press and in the commentariat, we often hear that India would have an opportunity in case of a Taiwan contingency to take action on the LAC, either for its own ends or as in the Indian press, we'll see people saying India should act on the LAC opportunistically while China is distracted. In America, we'll see people arguing that India should act on the LAC to distract China from Taiwan. I think all of those arguments are beside the point. I don't think that would be an effective form of Indian action to act on the LAC. And I can go into my reasoning for that, but essentially it comes down to the PLA being big enough and Western Theatre Command being capable enough to be able to handle such diversionary probes without affecting what happens on China's eastern seaboard. The other idea that we often hear is that India can and should undertake a distant blockade of China by acting in the Indian Ocean, closing the Strait of Malacca or some such sort of embargo or blockade. And again, I think that is unfeasible for different reasons, particularly because it would take too long. It would require too great a capability lift from India. It would be too disruptive to the global economy, and it would not have a strategic effect on Beijing for months. There's been analysis, public open source analysis, suggesting that it would take months for such a distant blockade to make a decisive impact on China's decision making. So, okay, if we're not talking about action on the LAC, and if we're not talking about a distant blockade in the Indian Ocean, what are we talking about when I say an out-of-area military support? Essentially, what I'm suggesting, next slide, please, is focusing on the Indian Ocean, but not in the way we often hear about it. The premise here, the premise of my argument is that in any contingency, the United States is going to flow forces from the CENTCOM AOR, right, in the West, for everything from in the CENTCOM AOR and the EUCOM AOR, right, from the Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf. It's going to flow forces eastward across the Indian Ocean to the first island chain. That is, I think, a fairly reasonable premise. And if that is the case, then India has several very important potential roles to play. And again, I come back to the point that I made earlier, that there is a spectrum of how modest or ambitious India wants to be here. India has the opportunity to calibrate how much of this policy option it chooses to undertake. In a more modest version, it would just be about increasing its presence and operations in the northwestern Indian Ocean, as indeed it has done in the Red Sea recently around the time of the increase in piracy and Houthi attacks. It has the capacity to do that, and I think it has a national interest to do that, to essentially to backfill the US forces that would depart the AOR to deploy towards the first island chain. If India were to calibrate this policy option a little bit more, it could work alongside the US force flow, essentially to provide force protection or security to that US force flow. And this would take the form mostly of ASW patrols. I would anticipate, if we anticipate that the US will flow forces from the CENTCOM AOR, I think we can also anticipate that the PLAN will try to disrupt that force flow, primarily with the use of submarines. And so providing security to that US force flow, especially through ASW, would be a very useful out-of-area means of support. Another calibrated option is to make use of recently signed agreements that allow Indian dockyards to maintain and repair US ships. In the case of a prolonged conflict, of course, I think China would prefer a short conflict that imposes a fait accompli quickly. But if it's unable to do that and the conflict becomes prolonged, we can anticipate that the US will have ships that require maintenance and repair, and India provides a venue for that. And in probably the most ambitious avatar of this policy option, the US could pre-position equipment or ammunition on Indian soil, either on the Indian mainland or in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Again, the US increasingly does this with its allies already, with the Philippines and with Australia, for example, when there is an annual cycle of exercises. The US forces may, for example, leave behind certain stocks in anticipation of using them in the next annual training cycle. And in the same sort of vein, there is scope to pre-position stocks where they can be readily accessed in wartime, especially from ANC, but also from the Indian mainland. Now, you will note that all of these options are non-kinetic. This is just India supporting the US out of area. And so India would remain not a belligerent in the case of these options. And I think China would then be faced with a very invidious dilemma of expanding to war to attack India. And again, it would probably choose not to do that. So I don't think this would expose India to action. I just realized I'm running way over time beyond where I wanted to. Let me go next slide, please, and just conclude with a couple of points. What I've laid out so far and what the main purpose of my research is to do is to lay out what options may be available to India. But what I also did subsequently was publish one op-ed that you can see here, and next slide again, which is essentially to make the case that India should act. Not only that India has options to act, next slide please, but that India should act. And this argument falls to three main arguments. The first is that India has a growing interest in the status quo in and around Taiwan. It has a burgeoning trade relationship with Taiwan and a tech relationship with Taiwan, about to build a semiconductor fab in India. Secondly, that the war would be catastrophic, even compared to the global financial crisis, even compared to the pandemic. Economic modeling suggests that a war over Taiwan would cost something like 10% of global GDP for multiple years. And the Indian economy is more exposed to this risk than even the US economy, because it is more exposed not only to China and Taiwan, but also to Korea and Japan, whose economies would be even more devastated. And thirdly, that if a war should occur, and if it should occur before the United States is able to defend Taiwan, and if China therefore is victorious in such a war, it would be strategically catastrophic. It would be the end of the US security order in the Indo-Pacific. And again, we can talk about that. But I would suggest it would imperil US alliances, and it would imperil US strategic partnerships across the region. And China, importantly, would be emboldened to act elsewhere, including on the Indian border, including with Arunachal Pradesh. And it would no longer, perhaps most importantly, it would no longer have the overweening priority of preparing for a Taiwan contingency. So the PLA would then be freed to divert the resources that thus far have been spent on Taiwan and preparing for Taiwan to other contingencies. And India is in the unfortunate position of being on that list. Next slide. My final point is again, just to reiterate a couple of points that I've already made. First and foremost, this is not about a favor to the United States or to Taiwan. This is about Indian self-interest. As I've suggested, with the economic costs and the strategic costs and India's relationship with Taiwan, India has its own reasons to act here. I would suggest, again, as I've said, that this is a menu of options that can be calibrated. It's not a fixed take it or leave it set of options. But the final point I would leave you with is that this is all about deterrence, right? India is not going to win a war over Taiwan. India's contribution will not win a war over Taiwan, but India can make a difference before Xi Jinping makes a decision to launch, to convince Xi Jinping and the CCP that they have not adequately set the conditions and that the time to attack is not now. I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I've only left a handful of minutes left for Q&A, but I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Arjun, for your excellent exposure. We will now take on some questions which may be forthcoming. I would initially request from the participants who have joined us on Webex link, if you have any question, please raise your hand and then we'll come back to you. Anyone from the Webex link who has any questions? Okay, I believe the clarity has left no doubts in their mind. Now we shall revert back to the people who are there, sitting next to me.
Mr. Arzan, thank you very much for the detailed and a very clear discussion with respect to Taiwan. I just wanted you to elaborate and make clear as to what exactly do you mean by saying that set conditions for assault, which you have been kind of emphasizing time and again. So you can elaborate, would be great.
Sure. So the premise of this is that, and again, this is based on my received wisdom from China specialists. The premise of this is that China has a very comprehensive campaign to unify with Taiwan. Comprehensive meaning all tools of national power are used, and that the military tool is only essentially the tool of last resort. That if it uses the military tool, it will be because it believes that it has exhausted other non-military ways of unifying with Taiwan, that it has no option but to act militarily, and B, it will only do that when it believes it has done everything it can to prepare the battle space to achieve a quick and decisive victory over Taiwan. So what that means specifically is everything from preparing the information domain to make sure, for example, that the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese political class are convinced that Chinese victory is inevitable and that they should just capitulate as quick as possible. To prepare the battle space by making it difficult for the US to intervene, and whatever that means operationally, by, for example, deploying east of Taiwan, or by trying to prepare the battle space by making it unpalatable for countries like Japan to join, by messaging Japan to say, hey, listen, it would be suicidal for you to join this fight. And if you don't join this fight, then we will respect your sovereignty and not attack US bases, or whatever the case may be, right? I'm not a Chinese planner, but from the perspective of Chinese planners, I think given the stakes involved from the CCP's perspective, that this is a no-fail scenario for them, that they will only launch when they are satisfied they have done everything they can to ensure a quick and decisive victory. And so the idea is to make them doubt that they have done that, to make them think that actually, you know what, we haven't done enough yet on the diplomatic front. We haven't done enough yet in making our legal case to the world. We haven't done enough yet in economically coercing countries like India. So to make them lose confidence that they can win, right? This is deterrence by denial, to convince them that they will not win, and so therefore that they do not launch.
Thank you.
Sir, thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask regarding that India was also one of the first countries to recognize the PRC under its One China policy. So how could you see that it would be in India's national interest or self-interest to go against the One China policy and actually come to the rescue of Taiwan in any case of contingency?
So let's be clear. I am not suggesting, and I think I've said this, but it bears repeating. I am not suggesting that India come to the rescue of Taiwan. What I'm suggesting is that India make it clear that war is unacceptable, that military aggression is unacceptable anywhere in the Indo-Pacific. And so, yes, India was one of the first countries to recognize China, and India holds, although it has never repeated the idea of one China, right? Or not never, I should say, but in the last, I think since the mid-1990s, with a very brief exception, since the mid-1990s, it does not articulate that it believes in a one China principle. Its position, MEA's position, is that we have made our position sufficiently clear and we don't need to keep repeating that. And so, yes, while the standing Indian policy is that it does not believe in Taiwan's independence or sovereignty or difference from Beijing, nevertheless, the argument here is that all of that is not the point. Taiwan's status, one China, none of that is the point. The point is to maintain security and stability in the region, and that military force is unacceptable. That is what I'm suggesting is India's policy, and in fact that is India's policy as well. So it's not about coming to the rescue of Taiwan. It's about articulating a clear position that India stands opposed to the use of force.
Okay, thank you very much. We would request you to give us time and again whenever it's clear on your deliberation on strategic issues, especially having the India connect. So thank you very much.